Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're journeying back in time to one of history's most fascinating and turbulent periods. The Italian Renaissance. We often think of this era as a golden age of art and culture, picturing Leonardo da Vinci painting the Mona Lisa or Michelangelo sculpting David. But behind this explosion of creativity was a political landscape that was just as dynamic and, frankly, a lot more chaotic. Forget a single, unified Italy. Instead, imagine a patchwork quilt of powerful, independent city-states, each with its own government, its own ambitions, and its own rivals. So, what exactly was a... Think of a major city like Florence, Venice, or Milan. But instead of being part of a larger country, it acted like a country itself. It had its own laws, its own army, its own currency, and it controlled the surrounding countryside, known as the Contado. This setup was unique in Europe at the time. While nations like France and England were centralizing power under a king, Italy was a vibrant collection of micronations, all competing for power, wealth, and influence. And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. This competition was fierce, but it also fueled the very innovation and patronage that made the Renaissance possible. The rulers of these states wanted to outdo each other, not just on the battlefield, but in the grandeur of their cathedrals, the beauty of their art, and the brilliance of their courts. Let's start our tour in Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance. Officially, Florence was a republic, meaning it was governed by its citizens. The word republic sounds great, right? Power to the people. But the reality was a bit more complicated. Political power was controlled by a complex system of guilds, or arti. These were professional associations for merchants, bankers, artisans, and other trades. To hold office, you had to be a member of one of these guilds. The government was led by a council called the Signoria, a group of 9 men known as priors, who were chosen by lottery from a pool of eligible guild members. This lottery system was meant to prevent any single family from holding power for too long. However, in practice, one family managed to dominate Florentine politics without ever holding the title of king or duke. The Medici were incredibly wealthy bankers. Their bank was one of the most respected in Europe, and they used this financial power to build a vast network of political allies. Through strategic loans, friendships, and political maneuvering, Cosimo de' Medici, and later his grandson Lorenzo de' Medici, became the de facto rulers of Florence. They controlled the elections, influenced policy, and essentially ran the city from behind the scenes. They were brilliant patrons of the arts, funding geniuses like Botticelli and Michelangelo, which helped cement their popularity and prestige. So, while Florence called itself a republic, it often functioned more like a carefully managed state run by a single powerful family. It was a republic in name, but a principality in practice. Now, let's sail northeast to the shimmering lagoon of Venice, the most serene Republic of Venice, as it was formerly known, was another republic, but it was vastly different from Florence. Venice was an oligarchy, which means ruled by the few. Its power wasn't based on guilds, but on a closed aristocracy of noble families whose names were written in a special golden book. If your family wasn't in that book, you had virtually no chance of holding any real political power. The head of the Venetian state was the Doge, who was elected for life. But don't picture an all-powerful monarch. The Doge was more like a constitutional. His powers were strictly limited by a series of councils. The most important of these was the Great Council, which comprised all the adult male nobles listed in the Golden Book. This council elected the other bodies of government, including the Senate, which handled foreign policy, and the dreaded Council of Ten. The Council of Ten was Venice's powerful state security committee. It was established to deal with threats to the state and was notorious for its secret trials and swift justice. Venice was a maritime empire built on trade and naval might. Its stability was its greatest asset. The complex system of councils and checks and balances was designed to prevent any one individual or family from seizing power and destabilizing the state, as the Medici had done in Florence. This system was so successful that the Venetian Republic lasted for over 1,000 years, a remarkable feat of political engineering. Moving on to Milan, we find a completely different model. Milan was not a republic, it was a duchy, ruled by a powerful duke who held absolute authority. During the early Renaissance, Milan was controlled by the Visconti family. They were classic medieval lords who ruled through military strength and dynastic power. They weren't elected, and they didn't pretend to be. They were the commanders of their army, the ultimate judges, and the source of all law. In the mid-15th century, the last Visconti duke died without a male heir. After a brief attempt at a republic, power was seized by a brilliant mercenary general, a condottiero named Francescus. He had married the illegitimate daughter of the last Visconti duke, giving him a thin veil of legitimacy, but his real claim to power was his army. The Sforza family ruled Milan as its new ducal dynasty. Like the Medici, they were great patrons of the arts, and Saint-Cézanne was Ludovico Sforza, who famously employed Leonardo da Vinci for nearly 2 decades. But unlike Florence, there was no illusion of citizen participation. In Milan, power came from the sword, and the duke's word was law. This autocratic style was much more typical of the monarchies emerging elsewhere in Europe. Finally, we have to talk about the Papal States. This was a unique entity that controlled a large chunk of central Italy, including the city of Rome. The ruler of the Papal States was, of course, the Pope. So here we have a theocracia state ruled by a religious leader. The Pope was the spiritual head of the Catholic Church for all of Western Europe. But in central Italy, he was also a temporal prince. He commanded armies, collected taxes, and engaged in the same kind of power politics as any other Italian ruler. The Renaissance popes, like Alexander VI of the infamous Borgia family, or the warrior pope Julius II, were often more concerned with expanding their territory and family fortunes than with spiritual matters. They used their religious authority to raise money for wars and massive building projects, like the new St. Peter's Basilica. The papal court in Rome was a hotbed of intrigue and ambition, as cardinals and their families vied for influence, hoping to one day secure the papacy for themselves. The Papal States show how, in Renaissance Italy, the line between religious and political power could become incredibly blurry. So, we have republics that acted like principalities in Florence, a stable oligarchy in Venice, a military dictatorship in Milan, and a theocracy in Rome. And these were just the major players. The Italian peninsula was also home to smaller duchies, like Ferrara and independent republics like Siena and Genoa. This fragmented political landscape had profound consequences. On one hand, The intense rivalry between these states created an environment where rulers used art and culture as political tools, sponsoring incredible works to display their power and prestige. This competition directly fueled the artistic brilliance of the Renaissance. On the other hand, this division made Italy vulnerable. The city-states were constantly at war with each other, often hiring mercenary armies to do their fighting. This constant infighting meant they could never unite against a common foreign threat. Starting in the late 15th century, the powerful, unified monarchies of France and Spain saw a rich and divided Italy as an easy prize. The Italian Wars, which began in 1494, saw these foreign armies invade the peninsula, wreaking havoc and eventually bringing many of the city-states under foreign domination. The very political fragmentation that had given the Renaissance its unique character ultimately led to its decline. The era of the independent city-state was coming to an end as Italy became a battleground for larger European powers. And there you have it, a whirlwind tour of the complex and fascinating political world of Renaissance Italy. It was a world of brilliant art and brutal politics, of republican ideals and autocratic rule, where bankers, nobles, popes, and generals all played the great game of power. It's a reminder that behind every great work of art, there's a story of money, power, and ambition. The role of the merchant class in the flourishing of art. When we think of the Renaissance, we often picture masterpieces like the Mona Lisa or the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But have you ever wondered who is bankrolling all this incredible art? It wasn't just kings and popes. A new, powerful force was reshaping society and art itself. The merchant class, the Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, was a chimney of rebirth. It was a rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, a surge in scientific inquiry, and an explosion of artistic creativity. But what fueled this fire? The answer, in large part, is money. And a lot of that money was flowing through the hands of a newly influential group of people. Before the Renaissance, European society was largely feudal. You had the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry. But as trade routes expanded, particularly with the East, cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became bustling hubs of commerce. A new class of wealthy bankers, wool traders, and silk merchants emerged. These weren't aristocrats born into power. They were self-made men, sharp, ambitious, and with a lot of disposable income. So, what do you do when you've made a fortune? You want to show it off, of course. But it was more than just vanity. For these merchants, commissioning art was a way to legitimize their new status. They couldn't claim a noble bloodline, but they could align themselves with culture, beauty, and intellect. Building a magnificent chapel, commissioning a family portrait by a famous artist, or donating a grand sculpture to the city was a powerful statement. It said, "I am successful, I am sophisticated, and I am a pillar of this community." This created a massive new market for artists. Before, an artist's main patrons were the church or the monarchy. Now, they had wealthy families competing for their talents. This competition drove up prices, but it also drove up innovation. Merchants weren't always bound by the strict religious conventions that the church demanded. They were open to new ideas and new subjects. Think about the Medici family in Florence. They were bankers, one of the wealthiest families in Europe, but they are perhaps best remembered as the greatest art patrons of the Renaissance. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo di Magnificent, didn't just buy art, he cultivated talent. He took a young Michelangelo under his wing, treating him almost like a son. and providing him with the education and resources to hone his genius. Without the Medici, would we have the same Michelangelo? It's hard to say. The Medici sponsored artists like Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and Donatello. Their wealth and their vision directly shaped the Florentine Renaissance. This shift in patronage also changed the art itself. While religious themes remained incredibly important, we start to see a rise in secular art. Wealthy merchants wanted portraits of themselves and their families, showcasing their fine clothes and prosperous households. We see paintings that celebrate civic life, historical events, and even myths and legends from classical antiquity. The famous painting, the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck, is a perfect example. It's a stunningly detailed depiction of a wealthy merchant and his wife in their home. It's not a scene from the Bible. It's a celebration of personal wealth, status, and perhaps a marriage contract. This was a revolutionary shift in what art was for. Furthermore, the merchant's worldview influenced the style of the art. These were practical, worldly men who valued realism and precision. This mindset resonated with the Renaissance's growing interest in humanism, focus on the individual and the natural world. Artists began to study anatomy, perspective, and light to make their work as lifelike as possible. The goal was no longer just to convey a spiritual idea, but to capture the beauty and complexity of the world as it truly appeared. The merchant patron appreciated this skill and attention to detail. It mirrored the precision they applied in their own businesses. The impact was felt beyond just painting and sculpture. Merchants funded architecture, building grand palaces or palazzi that lined the streets of Florence and Venice. They supported writers and philosophers, creating an intellectual environment where new ideas could flourish. Their wealth fueled the entire ecosystem of creativity. The artist was no longer just a humble craftsman, but could become a respected intellectual, a maestro whose company was sought by the rich and powerful. So, in essence, the merchant class acted as the venture capitalists of the Renaissance. They invested in art and culture, and the return on that investment was immense. They not only beautified their cities and secured their own legacies, but also created the conditions for some of the greatest artistic achievements in history. They turned their financial capital into cultural capital, and in doing so, they helped define an entire era. When we look at a Renaissance masterpiece today, it's easy to focus solely on the artist's genius. But behind that brushstroke, behind that chiseled marble, there was often a savvy merchant who saw the value in beauty, who understood the power of art, and who was willing to pay for it. The story of Renaissance art is not just a story of art, it's also the story of their patrons, the ambitious, culture-shaping merchants who proved that commerce and creativity can be a truly magnificent combination. Relationship between the church and the state during the Renaissance. We often picture artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, or thinkers like but behind these iconic figures was a society in constant flux, defined by a complex and often dramatic relationship. The tug-over between the church and the state. To understand the Renaissance, we have to start with the Middle Ages. For centuries, the Catholic Church was the undisputed heavyweight champion of Europe. It wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a political powerhouse. Popes crowned emperors, owned vast territories called the Papal States, and influenced everything from law to daily life. The Church was the glue that held Christendom together, and its authority was rarely questioned. The state, made up of various kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, often played second fiddle. Kings and princes were powerful, but they were expected to be defenders of the faith, their power legitimized by God and, by extension, the Church. Then, the Renaissance dawned, first in Italy, and then spreading across Europe. This rebirth was fueled by several things: renewed interest in the classical art and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome, the rise of a wealthy merchant class, and the invention of the printing press. This new environment began to subtly, and then not so subtly, change the old power dynamics. The stage was set for a major showdown. The heart of the conflict often boiled down to two things: power and money. Both the church and secular rulers wanted to be in charge. Rulers wanted to appoint their own bishops and clergy, a practice known as investiture, so they could ensure loyalty within their borders. The church, naturally, insisted that only the Pope had that authority. This created constant friction. Imagine a king needing a loyal advisor, but the Pope appoints someone loyal only to Rome. You can see how that would cause problems. Then there was the money. The church collected tithes, sold indulgences, and generated immense wealth from its lands. Kings and princes looked at that wealth with hungry eyes. They needed money to fund their armies, build their palaces, and run their growing administrations. So they started to assert their right to tax church property and clergy, something the church fiercely resisted. This wasn't just a squabble over cash. It was a fundamental question of sovereignty. Who was the ultimate authority in a kingdom, the king or the pope? In Italy, the situation was even more complicated. The pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a secular ruler himself, the head of the papal states. Popes like Julius II were known as warrior popes, literally leading armies into battle to expand their territory. They made and broke alliances with other Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan, and with powerful foreign kings from France and Spain. The lines between a prince and a pontiff became incredibly blurred. The Pope was playing the same political game as every other ruler, using diplomacy, marriage alliances, and military force to secure his power. This political maneuvering had a profound impact on the art we so admire. When a pope or a powerful cardinal commissioned a magnificent chapel or a breathtaking sculpture, it wasn't just about piety. It was a power move, a public relations campaign. The Sistine Chapel ceiling isn't just a masterpiece of religious art. It's a monumental statement of papal authority and divine favor. The Medici family in Florence, who were bankers and later rulers, sponsored artists to enhance their own prestige and legitimize their rule, often blurring the lines between civic pride and religious devotion. Art became a tool in the battle for influence. As the Renaissance progressed, new ideas began to challenge the church's traditional authority from within. The philosophy of humanism, which celebrated human potential and critical thinking, encouraged scholars to go back to the original sources, including the Bible. Thinkers like Erasmus of Rotterdam began to criticize corruption within the church, such as the selling of indulgences and the lavish lifestyles of some clergy. They weren't trying to break away from the church, but to reform it from the inside. They argued for a more personal, scripture-based faith, which shifted focus away from the institution and onto the individual's relationship with God. This intellectual ferment laid the groundwork for the biggest upheaval of all, the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther, a German monk, famously posted his 95 Theses. He directly challenged the Pope's authority and the Church's doctrines. Luther's ideas spread rapidly by the printing press, resonated with many people, including powerful German princes who saw an opportunity to break free from papal control and seize church lands and wealth for themselves. King Henry VIII of England is another perfect example. His desire for a male heir and his clash with the Pope over an annulment led him to declare himself the head of the Church of England, effectively nationalizing religion and transferring immense power and wealth from Rome to the English crown. The Reformation shattered the religious unity of Europe. Now, rulers had a choice. They could remain Catholic, or they could adopt a form of Protestantism. This choice was almost always a political one. A prince who converted to Lutheranism was also making a declaration of independence from the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. This triggered a century of devastating religious wars across Europe as states fought to determine whether they would be Catholic or Protestant. The state was now not just challenging the church, but actively deciding the religious identity of its people. In the end, the Renaissance fundamentally redrew the map of power in Europe. The church, while still influential, lost its position as the supreme political authority. In its place rose powerful, centralized nation-states where kings and queens held ultimate sovereignty. The idea of a unified Christendom governed by a single spiritual head gave way to a Europe of competing states, each with its own laws, its own army, and often its own national church. This epic struggle between the cross and the crown, between popes and princes, was not just a historical footnote. It shaped the very foundations of the modern world. It forged the concept of national sovereignty, influenced the separation of church and state, and demonstrated how art, ideas, and politics are always intertwined. The dazzling culture of the Renaissance was born from this tension, this grand and dramatic dance of power that redefined the Western world. Impact of the Reformation on society. When you think of the Renaissance, what comes to mind? Masterpieces by Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Groundbreaking scientific discoveries. It was definitely all of that. A dazzling era of rebirth in art and science. But what if I told you that another revolution, a spiritual one, was brewing at the same time, and it would shake the very foundations of European society? This was the Protestant Reformation, and its impact went far beyond the church doors, reshaping politics, culture, and even how people saw themselves. Forget everything you thought you knew about this period, because today we're diving deep into how this powerful religious movement completely redefined the Renaissance world. It's a story of faith, rebellion, and radical change that still echoes today. So, to really get a grip on this, let's set the scene. Imagine late medieval Europe. There's one dominant spiritual authority, the Catholic Church. It's more than just a place of worship. It's the center of life, a massive political and economic power. The Pope in Rome holds immense influence over kings and kingdoms. But by the 5th, 10th, and early 16th centuries, cracks were beginning to show. Many people felt the church had become too worldly, too focused on wealth and power. Practices like selling indulgences, basically paying to reduce time in purgatory, felt deeply corrupt to many. At the same time, the Renaissance spirit of humanism was encouraging critical thinking and a return to original sources. Scholars like Erasmus of Rotterdam were starting to study the Bible in its original Greek and Hebrew, and they noticed discrepancies between scripture and contemporary church practices. This intellectual curiosity, combined with widespread discontent, created a tinderbox. All it needed was a spark, and that spark was a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther, troubled by the sale of indulgences, famously nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. He wasn't trying to start a revolution, at least not at first. He wanted a debate, a reform asterisk with an asterisk. The church, but his ideas that salvation comes through faith alone, not good works or payments, and that the Bible, not the Pope, is the ultimate religious a thorough explosive. Thanks to a revolutionary new technology, the printing press, his theses and other writings spread like wildfire across Europe. Suddenly, ideas that were once confined to scholarly circles were being debated in taverns and town squares. The Pope demanded he recant, but Luther refused. His act of defiance ignited a movement that would splinter Western Christianity forever. The immediate and most obvious impact was on the religious landscape. Europe, once united under Catholicism, was now a patchwork of competing faiths. Germany, Scandinavia, and parts of Switzerland and the Netherlands embraced Lutheranism or other forms of Protestantism like Calvinism, led by John Calvin in Geneva. This wasn't a peaceful transition. This division led to over a century of brutal religious wars. The 30 Years' War, for example, devastated Central Europe, killing millions and redrawing the political map. Nations were torn apart as rulers chose a faith for their kingdom, often forcing their subjects to convert or flee. This period created a new, tragic figure in European society: the religious refugee fleeing persecution. The ideal of a unified Christendom was shattered, replaced by a continent of divided, often hostile states. But the Reformation's impact stretched far beyond the battlefield and into the halls of power. By challenging the Pope's authority, Protestant leaders inadvertently handed immense power to secular rulers, kings and princes, who adopted Protestantism could now seize the vast lands and wealth owned by the Church within their territories. This was a massive financial windfall. Furthermore, they became the heads of their national churches. Think of Henry VIII in England, who broke with Rome not just for personal reasons, but to establish the Church of England with himself at its head. This fusion of church and state strengthened the monarchy and helped lay the groundwork for the modern nations. The political center of gravity shifted from Rome to the individual capitals of Europe: London, Stockholm, Berlin. The old medieval power balance was gone for good. Now, let us talk about something incredibly important: how the Reformation changed daily life and the very fabric of society. A core Protestant belief was the priesthood of all believers. This meant that every individual could have a direct relationship with God without needing a priest as an intermediary. To do that, you had to be able to read the Bible for yourself. This created an unprecedented demand for literacy. Protestant leaders championed education for both boys and girls so they could read the scriptures. The printing press went into overdrive, producing Bibles in vernacular languages, French instead of just Latin. This literacy boom had effects far beyond religion. A more educated populace could engage with new ideas in politics, science, and philosophy, fueling further innovation and social change. Education was no longer the exclusive domain of the clergy and nobility. This new focus on the individual and their direct connection to God also reshaped economic attitudes. The sociologist Max Weber famously argued that the Protestant work ethic played a crucial role in the rise of capitalism. How? Well, Calvinism, in particular, introduced the idea of predestinations, that God had already chosen who would be saved. This could be terrifying, so believers looked for signs of being among the elect. Worldly success achieved through hard work, thrift, and discipline came to be seen as one such sign. This mindset encouraged accumulating wealth, not for lavish spending, but for reinvestment. It sanctified work and frowned upon idleness. This cultural shift, this newfound virtue in diligent, sober work, created a fertile ground for the growth of a market economy and the capitalist spirit that would come to define the modern Western world. What about art and culture? The Renaissance is famous for its religious art, but the Reformation changed the game. Many Protestant groups where iconoclasty viewed religious statues and elaborate paintings as idols, forbidden by the Bible. In some places, this led to waves of destruction, as mobs stormed churches and smashed centuries-old works of art. But this didn't mean the end of art. Instead, artistic focus shifted. In Protestant countries like the Netherlands, artists like Rembrandt and Vermeer turned their incredible talents to new subjects. They painted portraits of merchants and civic leaders, detailed scenes of everyday life, and stunning landscapes. Art became more personal and secular, reflecting the values of a rising middle class rather than the sole glory of the church. It was a democratization of art, mirroring the democratization of faith. So, as you can see, the Protestant Reformation was much more than a theological dispute. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through every aspect of Renaissance society. It broke the religious unity of Europe, sparking wars but also forging modern nations. It empowered kings, elevated the individual, and spurred on literacy and education in an unprecedented way. It subtly reshaped economic values, helping to pave the way for capitalism. And it redirected the course of Western art. The Renaissance was an age of rebirth, and the Reformation was its fiery, rebellious soul. It challenged the old world, and in doing so, helped create the one we live in today. The questions it raised about authority, faith, and the individual are questions we are still grappling with. Women in the Renaissance. We're journeying back in time to one of the most transformative periods in history, the Renaissance. We often hear about the great male artists and thinkers of this era. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Machiavelli. But what about the other half of the population? What was life actually like for women during the Renaissance? It's a story far more complex and fascinating than you might imagine, filled with contradictions, constraints, and incredible moments of brilliance. So, grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and let's uncover the hidden world of Renaissance women. First, let's set the stage. The Renaissance, spanning from the 14th to the 17th century, was a rebirth of art, science, and culture, originating in Italy and spreading across Europe. But this rebirth wasn't equally distributed. For women, society was overwhelmingly patriarchal. The ideal woman was often described by the motto, chaste, silent, and obedient. Her life was largely defined by her relationship to men as a daughter, a wife, and a mother. A woman's primary role was to marry, manage the household, and produce heirs, preferably male, to continue the family lineage. Let's start with childhood and education. For most girls, formal education was a rarity. If you were born into a peasant or artisan family, your education would be practical. You'd learn how to spin, weave, cook, manage a garden, and perhaps help with the family trade. Literacy was not a priority. For girls in the nobility or wealthy merchant classes, things were a bit different. They might receive a basic education at home or in a convent, learning to read, write, and do some arithmetic. This wasn't for intellectual liberation, but to make them more desirable marriage prospects, capable of managing a large household and its accounts. Their curriculum often included music, dance, and needlework, the so-called feminine arts. However, higher learning in subjects like law, medicine, or theology was almost exclusively for men. The idea of a woman attending a university was simply unthinkable. Marriage was the central event in a Renaissance woman's life, but it was rarely about love or personal choice. Marriages, especially among the upper classes, were strategic alliances between families. They were business transactions designed to consolidate wealth, forge political connections, and secure social standing. A girl could be betrothed as a child and married in her early teens. Dowry, the wealth the bride brought to her husband's family, was a crucial part of these negotiations. A large dowry could elevate a family's status, while a small one could limit a girl's marriage prospects significantly. Once married, a woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed by her husband's. She had very few property rights and was expected to be completely subservient to him. Within the home, a wife was the manager, the mistress of the household. This was a demanding job. For a noblewoman, it meant overseeing a large staff of servants, managing supplies, hosting important guests, and upholding the family's reputation. For a woman of a lower class, it meant doing all the physical labor herself, from fetching water and baking bread to raising children and tending livestock. Motherhood was, of course, a central and dangerous part of life. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for women, and infant mortality rates were tragically high. A woman might give birth to 10 or 12 children in the hope that a few would survive to adulthood. This constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth took a massive toll on women's health. So, with all these restrictions, did women have any power or influence at all? The answer is yes, but it often operated in subtle, unofficial ways. Within the domestic sphere, a capable wife could wield considerable informal power. Some women, particularly widows, found a surprising degree of autonomy. A widow who inherited her husband's business or estate could manage her own affairs, a level of freedom denied to most married women. The convent also offered an alternative path for women who were unwilling or unable to marry. Entering a convent could provide an opportunity for education, artistic expression, and a life of spiritual devotion, free from the demands of a husband and childbirth. Some of the most learned women of the era were nuns. Now, let's talk about the exceptions, the extraordinary women who broke the mold. Despite the barriers, some remarkable women managed to achieve public recognition for their talents. In the world of arts, we have figures like Art, a brilliant painter who followed in her father's footsteps. Her work is powerful and dramatic, and she became the first woman accepted into the prestigious Academy of the Arts of Drawing in Florence. We also have Sofonisba Anguissa, another talented portrait painter who gained international fame and even served as a court painter to the Spanish king. These women were exceptional not just for their talent, but for their sheer determination to succeed in a world designed to exclude them. The world of letters also saw its share of trailblazing women. Christine de Pisa, writing at the very beginning of the Renaissance, is often considered Europe's first professional female author. In her famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she argued against the rampant misogyny of her time, creating an allegorical city populated by history's most accomplished women. Later, writers like Veronica Franco in Venice, a celebrated poet and courtesan, used their wit and intellect to navigate and critique the society they lived in. These women used their pens as tools of power, proving that the female voice, though often silenced, could be incredibly potent, even in the realm of politics. Typically a man's world, some women wielded immense influence. Think of Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua. She was a major patron of the arts, a skilled diplomat, and a savvy political leader who ruled Mantua in her husband's absence. Her court was one of the most cultured in Europe. And of course, we have the great queens like Elizabeth I of England and Catherine de' Medici of France. While their positions were inherited, their ability to rule effectively and navigate treacherous political landscapes for decades demonstrated incredible strength and intelligence. They proved that women could govern just as effectively as men, challenging the very foundations of patriarchal rule. However, it's crucial to remember that these women were the exceptions, not the rule. For the vast majority of women, life during the Renaissance was one of limited choices and significant hardship. The era's celebration of the individual of the famous Renaissance man rarely extended to the Renaissance woman. The cultural and intellectual advancements that we so admire from this period were built on a social structure that, for the most part, kept women in a subordinate and domestic role. Their contributions, their labor, and their lives were essential to the functioning of society, but they were largely unrecorded and so. As we look back at the Renaissance, it's important to see the full picture. It was an age of breathtaking artistic achievement and intellectual ferment, but it was also an age of stark social inequality. By uncovering the stories of women from the anonymous peasant to the celebrated queen, we gain a richer, more complete understanding of this pivotal moment in history. We see not just a world of constraints, but also a world of resilience, creativity, and quiet strength. The women of the Renaissance may have been largely confined to the private sphere, but their influence was felt everywhere in ways both big and small, shaping the world we have inherited today. Education during the Renaissance. We're journeying back in time to an era of explosive creativity, groundbreaking science, and a profound shift in how we see the world and ourselves. The Renaissance, we often think of the stunning art of Michelangelo or the brilliant inventions of Leonardo da Vinci. But what was the engine driving this incredible transformation? It was education. So grab your thinking caps, because we're about to uncover how the Renaissance completely redefined learning. Before the Renaissance, during the Middle Ages, education was largely controlled by the church and was primarily for the clergy. The focus was on theology, and learning was based on scholasticism, a method that emphasized tradition and dogma over independent inquiry. Latin was the language of the learned, making knowledge inaccessible to most people who spoke their local vernaculars. For the vast majority, life didn't involve formal schooling at all. Skills were passed down through apprenticeships, and the world of books and ideas remained a distant, closed-off realm. But as the 14th century dawned, the seeds of change were being sown, especially in the bustling city-states of Italy. So, what flipped the switch? A new intellectual movement called humanism. Imagine rediscovering a treasure chest of lost knowledge. That is what happened as scholars began to unearth and study ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. Thinkers like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, championed a return to these classical sources. Humanists believed that the ancient world offered a model for excellence, not just in art and literature, but in living a virtuous, well-rounded life. They argued that education shouldn't just be about preparing for the afterlife. It should be about developing a person's full potential here on earth. This was a revolutionary idea. The focus shifted from a purely God-centered universe to one that also celebrated human intellect, creativity, and agency. This new philosophy placed humanity at the center of its own story. This humanist philosophy gave birth to a new curriculum, the Studia Humanitatis, or the Studies of Humanity. This was the liberal arts education of the Renaissance, and it was designed to create a complete citizen. So, what did students actually learn? The curriculum was built on 5 key subjects: grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy. Grammar and rhetoric taught students how to read, write, and speak persuasively and eloquently, primarily in classical Latin and Greek. History wasn't just about memorizing dates. It was seen as a practical guide to life, offering lessons from the successes and failures of the past. Poetry was valued for its beauty and its ability to explore the human condition and moral philosophy. Drawing from thinkers like Cicero and Seneca provided a framework for ethical living and active participation in civic life. This was a far cry from the narrow, theology-focused education of the medieval period. Now, who had access to this new and improved education? Well, it was still a privilege, largely reserved for the sons of the wealthy elite, the nobles, and the rising merchant class. These families understood that a humanist education was a status symbol and a pathway to power and influence. It prepared their sons for careers in politics, diplomacy, law, or managing the family business. Lavish private tutoring was common, with families hiring renowned humanist scholars to educate their children at home. Boarding schools, like the one founded by Vittorino da Feltre in Mantua, also emerged. His school was revolutionary because it combined rigorous intellectual study with physical true embodiment of the classical ideal of a sound mind in a sound body. Students would study Cicero in the morning and practice fencing or wrestling in the afternoon. What about women? For the most part, formal education remained out of reach. A woman's education, if she received one, was typically conducted at home and was focused on preparing her to be a virtuous wife and mother. She would learn domestic skills, music, dance, and perhaps enough reading to study religious texts. However, there were remarkable exceptions. Some aristocratic women, like Isabella d'Este of Mantua or Queen Elizabeth I of England, received excellent humanist educations and became influential patrons of the arts and skilled political leaders. Other women, particularly in religious convents, also had opportunities for learning and scholarship that were denied to their secular sisters. These women were pioneers, but they were the exception, not the rule. The Renaissance may have been a rebirth, but the doors of opportunity were not thrown open equally for everyone. One of the single most important catalysts for the spread of these new ideas was Johann Gutenberg's invention of the printing press around 1440. Before Gutenberg, books were handwritten manuscripts, painstakingly copied by scribes. They were incredibly rare, expensive, and prone to errors. The printing press changed everything. Suddenly, books could be produced quickly, accurately, and far more cheaply. Classical texts, humanist treatises, scientific papers, and religious works could be distributed across Europe at an unprecedented speed. This democratization of knowledge fueled the Reformation, powered the scientific revolution, and allowed humanist ideas to spread from Italy to the rest of the continent. Literacy rates began to climb, and a culture of reading and intellectual exchange flourished. The printing press was the internet of its time, a disruptive technology that fundamentally altered how information was shared and consumed. The impact of Renaissance education was profound and long-lasting. It created a new kind of individual, the Renaissance man. This was the ideal person, someone like Leonardo da Vinci or Leon Battista Alberti, who was skilled in a wide variety of subjects, from painting and architecture to anatomy and engineering. This ideal emphasized versatility, curiosity, and the limitless potential of the human mind. Beyond creating well-rounded individuals, this educational model laid the groundwork for modern science. The humanist emphasis on observing the natural world, questioning authority, and reviving classical scientific texts directly paved the way for figures like Copernicus, Galileo, and Vesalius, who would challenge centuries-old beliefs and launch the scientific revolution. Our modern university systems, with their emphasis on the liberal arts and critical thinking, are direct descendants of the humanist academies of the Renaissance. So, When we admire the breathtaking dome of a Renaissance cathedral or get lost in a Shakespearean play, it's important to remember the educational revolution that made it all possible. The shift from a rigid, dogma-based system to a dynamic, human-centered education unleashed a wave of innovation that shaped the world we live in today. It championed the idea that learning is a lifelong pursuit that enriches not just the individual, but society as a whole. It's a powerful reminder that how we choose to educate ourselves and future generations has the power to change the course of history, the role of nobles and cultural elites. When you think of the Renaissance, what comes to mind? Is it Leonardo da Vinci sketching his flying machines, Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or Shakespeare writing his timeless plays? These are all iconic moments, but have you ever wondered who made it all possible? Who were the patrons, the trendsetters, and the power players funding this incredible explosion of art and culture? Tonight, we're diving deep into the world of the Renaissance elites, the nobles, and wealthy families. Who were the engines of this extraordinary era? The period from the 14th to the 17th century wasn't just a rebirth of art and science. It was also a time of immense social and political change. The old feudal system was fading, and a new kind of power was emerging, based not just on land and titles, but on wealth, influence, and, most importantly, culture. The nobles of the Renaissance understood that art was more than just decoration. It was a powerful tool for propaganda, a symbol of status, and a ticket to immortality. Let's start in Italy, the cradle of the Renaissance. Here, powerful city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan were ruled by influential families who were more like corporate CEOs than traditional kings. Take the Medici family of Florence, for example. They weren't royalty in the traditional sense. They were bankers, but through immense wealth and shrewd political maneuvering, they became the de facto rulers of Florence for generations. Cosimo de' Medici, and later his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent, transformed Florence into the epicenter of the art world. They didn't just buy art, they invested in artists. They established an academy in their own palace, bringing together the brightest minds of the day. They plucked a young Michelangelo from obscurity and treated him like a son, dining with him and discussing philosophy. By sponsoring artists like Botticelli, Donatello, and Leonardo da Vinci, the Medici weren't just beautifying their city, they were crafting their legacy. Every painting, sculpture, and building they commissioned screamed Medici power, Medici taste, Medici piety. It was the ultimate branding exercise, but patronage wasn't just about showing off. For these nobles, it was also a way to cleanse their souls. Many, like the Medici, made their fortunes through usury or money lending with interest, which was considered a sin by the church. Lavish spending on churches, chapels, and religious art was seen as a form of penance, a way to balance the spiritual books and secure a place in heaven. So, while they were building their earthly legacy, they were also investing in their eternal salvation. It was a win. Moving beyond Italy, the Renaissance spirit spread across Europe, adapted by the royal courts of France, England, and Spain. King Francis I of France was so enamored with the Italian Renaissance that he essentially tried to import it. He famously invited an aging Leonardo da Vinci to his court, giving him a grand chateau and the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. Francis saw art and culture as essential to the glory of the French monarchy. His Chateau de Chambord, with its rumored touches of Leonardo's genius, is a breathtaking monument to this ambition. In England, the Tudor dynasty, especially under Henry VIII and Lady Elizabeth I, used culture to solidify their power. After breaking with the Catholic Church, they needed to create a new, distinctively English national identity. They patronized artists like Hans Holbein the Younger, whose powerful portraits of the court created an unforgettable image of Tudor authority. Later, Elizabeth I's court became a hub for literature and theater. She understood the power of spectacle and performance, cultivating an image of herself as the Virgin Queen Gloriana, celebrated in the poetry of Edmund Spenser and the plays of courtiers. It was a masterful use of culture to create a personal brand that unified the nation. But what was life actually like for these nobles? It was a constant performance. Your education was paramount. A true Renaissance nobleman or woman was expected to be a universal person, a Renaissance man or woman. You had to know Latin and Greek, be able to compose a sonnet, play a musical instrument, ride a horse, and wield a sword with grace. Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, a bestseller of its time, was the ultimate guide on how to behave. It preached the concept of sprezzatura, a kind of effortless grace, making difficult things look easy. You had to be brilliant, but never look like you were trying too hard. The clothing they wore was a key part of this performance. Sumptuous fabrics like silk, velvet, and brocade, often woven with gold and silver thread, were used to display wealth. The laws of the time, known as sumptuary laws, even dictated who could wear what. But the elites always found ways to push the boundaries, showcasing the latest fashions from Italy or Spain. Their homes, too, were theaters of power. They were filled not just with art, but with libraries of classical texts, collections of ancient artifacts, and cabinets of curiosities filled with exotic objects from the newly discovered corners of the world. Hosting a lavish banquet or a philosophical discussion in such a setting was a way to display not just your wealth, but your intellect and worldliness. It's crucial to remember, however, that this golden age for the elites was built on the labor of the man. While nobles debated Plato and commissioned masterpieces, the vast majority of the population were peasants or laborers, whose lives were largely untouched by this cultural revolution. The Renaissance was, in many ways, an exclusive club. The art and ideas we celebrate today were created by a select few, for a select few. So, as we look back at the magnificent achievements of the Renaissance, let's remember the complex web of ambition, piety, and power that made it all happen. The nobles and cultural elites of the era were not just passive admirers of art. They were its architects, its financiers, and its primary audience. Through their patronage, they shaped the course of Western art and thought, creating a legacy that continues to inspire and awe us centuries later. They understood that true power wasn't just about armies and treasuries, but about capturing the hearts and minds of generations to come. And in that, they were true masters. Daily life in Renaissance cities. We are traveling back in time, not to the grand courts of kings or the battlefields of knights, but to the bustling, chaotic, and vibrant streets of a Renaissance city. What was it really like to wake up in Florence or Venice in the 15th century? Let's find out. As dawn breaks, the city doesn't wake up to an alarm clock, but to the sound of church bells. These bells are the rhythm of the day, calling people to prayer, signaling the start of the workday, and warning of fires or attacks. The very first thing most people would do is say a prayer. Religion was woven into the fabric of everyday existence, a constant presence from morning till night. Forget spacious apartments. Most city dwellers lived in cramped, multi-story tenement buildings. Families, often including grandparents, aunts, and uncles would be packed into just a few rooms. The ground floor was typically a workshop or a shop with the living quarters stacked above. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Your window would open onto a narrow, crowded street filled with the sounds and, yes, the smells of hundreds of your neighbors. Speaking of smells, let's talk about sanitation, or rather, the lack of it. There were no sewer systems as we know them. People would toss their household waste, including food, scraps, and the contents of their chamber pots, right out the window into the street below. You'd have to be careful walking around. Gutters in the middle of the street would carry away some of the filth, especially when it rained. But the stench must have been overwhelming. Animals like pigs and dogs roamed freely, acting as a sort of four-legged cleanup crew. So, what's for breakfast? For the average person, it would be simple and hearty. A chunk of coarse bread, maybe some cheese, and a bit of watered-down wine or ale. Water from public fountains was often contaminated, so low alcohol drinks were a safer bet, even for children. The wealthy, of course, had more variety, but for most, meals were about fuel for a hard day's work. And work began early. The city was a hive of industry. The streets were a symphony of noise. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the whir of the weaver's loom, the chatter of merchants haggling in the marketplace. Most people were artisans or tradesmen belonging to a guild. These guilds were powerful organizations that controlled everything from the quality of goods to the prices and training of apprentices. A boy would start as an apprentice around the age of 7, living with his master and learning a trade for years, hoping to one day become a master himself. The marketplace, or piazza, was the heart of the city. It was more than just a place to shop. It was the social hub. Here, you'd find farmers selling fresh produce, butchers carving meat, and vendors hawking everything from spices from the east to locally made cloth. It was a sensory overload of sights, sounds, and smells. News and gossip spread like wildfire here, carried by word of mouth as there were no newspapers. Public announcements were made, and even punishments were carried out in the main square for all to see. Now, what about the women? A woman's life was largely defined by her social class. Noble women were often educated in arts, music, and literature, but their primary role was to manage the large household staff and produce heirs. For the vast majority of women in the artisan and merchant classes, life was a constant whirl of work. They managed the household finances, raised the children, cooked, cleaned, and often worked alongside their husbands in the family business, whether it was running a shop, weaving textiles, or helping in the workshop. Their contribution was absolutely essential to the family's survival and success. As the sun began to set, the workday would come to an end. Again signaled by the church bells, people would head home for their main meal of the day. This might be a potager thick stew of vegetables and grains, sometimes with a little meat if you were lucky. The family would gather to eat, share stories, and perhaps play a simple game of dice or cards by candlelight or the light of the hearth. But the city didn't completely shut down at night. The streets were dark and dangerous, unlit, except for the occasional lantern outside a wealthy home or a tavern. City gates were locked, and the night watch patrolled the streets, looking for criminals, drunkards, and fires. Taverns were popular spots for men to gather after work to drink, gamble, and socialize. It was a rough, boisterous environment, a stark contrast to the piety of the daytime. Despite the hardships, the dirt, and the dangers, Renaissance cities were places of incredible energy and opportunity. They were melting pots of ideas where an artist could find a patron, a merchant could make a fortune, and a scholar could access books and new knowledge, the very density of people and professions sparked the innovation and creativity that we now call the Renaissance. Living there was tough, no doubt, but it was also to be at the center of a world that was changing faster than ever before. And that was a day in the life. It's a world away from our modern comforts, isn't it? It really makes you appreciate running water and electricity, economic system, and banking in Florence. Tonight, our journey takes us to the heart of the Renaissance, where breathtaking art and economic secrets go hand in hand, telling the story of an extraordinary era. We're heading to Florence, the cradle of this incredible cultural rebirth, to explore how a city of merchants and bankers fundamentally changed the world of money. You see, while we marvel at Michelangelo's David and Botticelli's Venus, it's easy to forget that these masterpieces weren't created in a vacuum. They were funded, commissioned. They were the product of immense wealth, and that wealth was generated by one of the most sophisticated economic systems of the era. So, how did Florence become the Wall Street of the 15th century? Let's dive in. Our story begins with wool. Long before they were famous for art, Florentines were masters of the textile trade. The Arci della Lana, or the Wool Guild, was a powerhouse. They imported raw wool from England and Spain, and through a highly organized, almost assembly line process, transformed it into the finest quality cloth in Europe. This cloth, dyed in vibrant colors, was a luxury item sought after by royalty and nobility across the continent. This trade didn't just bring in money, it created a complex network of international merchants, suppliers, and distributors, all centered in Florence. But trading goods across Europe was risky and complicated. Imagine trying to pay a supplier in London with a cart full of physical gold coins. It was dangerous and wildly impractical. This is where the Florentine genius for finance truly shines. To solve this problem, they perfected something called the bill of exchange. Think of it as the great-great-grandfather of the modern check or wire transfer. A Florentine merchant could deposit money with a banker in Florence and receive a bill. He could then send this bill to his trading partner in, say, that partner could then take the bill to the Florentine Bank S branch or correspondent in Bruges and cash it out in the local currency. It was revolutionary. It eliminated the need to transport bulky, risky shipments of precious metals, making international trade faster, safer, and much more efficient. This innovation was the cornerstone of Florentine financial dominance. And who were the masters of this new financial universe? The banking families. And when you talk about Florentine banking, one name stands above all others: the Medici. The Medici Bank, founded by Giovanni di Bicci di Medici, was more than just a place to store money. It was a multinational corporation with branches in all the major European cities: London, Geneva, Venice, Rome. They didn't just manage the wealth of merchants. They became the personal bankers to the papacy itself. This was a massive coup. Handling the Pope's finances gave them unparalleled prestige, influence, and, of course, enormous profits. The Medici perfected techniques like double entry bookkeeping, which allowed them to track debits and credits with incredible accuracy. This might sound boring, but it was a technological leap in accounting that gave them a crystal clear picture of their financial health, allowing them to manage risk and maximize profit like never before. They were the data analysts of their day. This immense wealth had a profound impact on the city itself. The Medici and other wealthy families like the Strozzi and the Pitti became the ultimate patrons of the arts. They weren't just showing off their riches, They saw art and architecture as a way to glorify their city, their family, and God. They competed with each other to commission the most magnificent chapels, the most beautiful paintings, and the most innovative buildings. When Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent, sponsored a young Michelangelo or supported the Platonic Academy, he was investing in the cultural capital of Florence. This patronage system is why Florence is overflowing with masterpieces. The money generated by wool and banking was directly funneled into the hands of artists, architects, and thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Brunelleschi, and Machiavelli. The Renaissance wasn't just an artistic movement. It was a flourishing economy's greatest project. But what about the currency itself? The coin of the realm was the gold florin. First minted in 1252, the florin quickly became the gold standard of Europe. It contained a consistent, reliable 3.5 grams of pure gold, making it a trusted international currency. When people talked about a florin, everyone from London to Constantinople knew exactly what its value was. This stability was crucial. It lubricated the wheels of commerce and cemented Florence's reputation. As the financial capital of the continent, the florin was the US dollar of its time. However, no golden age lasts forever. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the tide began to turn. The discovery of the New World and new sea routes to Asia by the Spanish and Portuguese shifted the economic center of gravity from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Trade routes that had made Italian city-states rich were now being bypassed. Furthermore, the political landscape was changing. Powerful nation-states like France and Spain began to flex their military muscle, leading to invasions and instability in Italy. The Medici Bank itself faced challenges from bad loans to political turmoil, and eventually declined. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 also disrupted traditional trade routes to the east. Florence's economic dominance waned as new powers and new global economies rose. Yet, the legacy of Renaissance Florence is immeasurable. The financial tools they created, bills of exchange, double-entry bookkeeping, international branch banking, laid the foundation for modern capitalism. They demonstrated how finance could fuel innovation and how wealth could be channeled to create timeless cultural achievements. So, the next time you see a painting from the Florentine Renaissance, remember the unseen world behind the canvas. Remember the wool merchants, the ambitious bankers, and the stable gold florin. You're not just looking at a work of art. You're looking at the beautiful dividend of one of history's most brilliant economic systems. Florence taught the world not just how to paint, but how to pay for it. The role of wars in spreading ideas. Tonight, we're diving into a fascinating and perhaps counterintuitive aspect of the Renaissance. How the very wars that ravaged Europe also acted as a powerful engine for spreading the brilliant ideas that defined the era. It sounds like a paradox, right? War is destructive, chaotic, and often seen as the enemy of progress. But as we'll see, the constant movement of armies, scholars, and artisans across the continent created an unexpected and dynamic network for cultural exchange. Let's set the stage. The Renaissance, stretching from the 14th to the 17th century, was a period of incredible rebirth in art, science, philosophy, and literature. It began in the wealthy city-states of Italy, Florence, Venice, Milan, which were buzzing with newfound creativity and the rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman knowledge. However, this intellectual fire didn't stay confined to Italy for long. A major catalyst for its spread was a series of conflicts known as the Italian Wars, which began in 1494. It all kicked off when King Charles VIII of France marched his massive army down the Italian peninsula to press a claim on the Kingdom of Naples. What he and his soldiers found there was mind-blowing. They weren't just met with Italian armies, they were met with a level of artistic sophistication and intellectual vibrancy they had never encountered before. The French nobility, who were part of this military campaign, were stunned by the magnificent architecture, the lifelike sculptures, and the elegant lifestyle of the Italian courts. Imagine a French soldier used to the imposing but more austere Gothic castles of his homeland, suddenly walking through a Florentine piazza, surrounded by the graceful designs of architects like Brunelleschi. He'd see sculptures by masters like Donatello that seemed to breathe with life. It was a culture shock, but a deeply inspiring one. When these soldiers and nobles eventually returned to France, they didn't just bring back spoils of war. They brought back new tastes, new ideas, and a burning desire to replicate this Italian splendor back home. This is a crucial point. Wars force people to move. Armies aren't just made of soldiers. They're followed by engineers, administrators, diplomats, and even artists. As these armies moved, they acted like a sponge, absorbing local culture and then squeezing it out in new locations. French King Francis I, who was deeply involved in the later Italian wars, became one of history's greatest patrons of the arts, precisely because of his exposure to the Italian Renaissance. He famously invited Leonardo da Vinci himself to France, where Leonardo spent his final years. He also brought over Italian artists like Rosso Fiorentino and Benvenuto Cellini, who were instrumental in developing what we now call the School of Fontainebleau, a unique French Renaissance style. Without the initial military campaigns, this direct transfer of talent might never have happened on such a grand scale. But the exchange wasn't just a one-way street from Italy to the rest of Europe. The constant conflict within Italy itself also shuffled the deck. When cities were sacked or governments overthrown, artists and thinkers who had enjoyed stable patronage were forced to flee. For example, the sack of Rome in 1527 by the troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was a horrific event. But it had an unintended consequence. It caused a mass exodus of artists, architects, and intellectuals from Rome, which had been a major hub of the High Renaissance. These refugees scattered across Italy and Europe, bringing their advanced skills and knowledge with them. A painter who had worked alongside Raphael in Rome might find new patronage in Venice, France, or even Spain, seeding the principles of the Roman school far and wide, beyond art and architecture. Military technology itself was a vehicle for intellectual exchange. The development of new fortification techniques, known as the Tres Italien or Star Fort, required sophisticated knowledge of geometry and engineering. As military engineers were hired by different kingdoms to build these state-of-the-art defenses, they carried with them the mathematical and scientific principles that were flourishing in Italian universities. A ruler who wanted the best fortress to protect his city had to import not just the design, but the designerant. That designer was a product of the Renaissance's intellectual environment. The same goes for advancements in metallurgy, for cannons, or the mathematics needed for accurate artillery fire. War created a demand for practical, applied science, and the experts in these fields became highly sought-after international commodities. Let's also consider the role of mercenaries. The Renaissance battlefield was filled with mercenary armies, or condottieri, who fought for the highest bidder. These soldiers came from all over Europe's Switzerland, Germany, Spain. As they fought in Italy, they were immersed in its culture. When their contracts ended or they returned home between campaigns, they carried with them not only their pay but also stories, habits, and maybe even a few books or pieces of art. This created a grassroots level of cultural diffusion, spreading Renaissance ideas not just among the elite, but among a broader population. This process also accelerated the adoption of humanism, the core philosophical movement of the Renaissance. Humanism emphasized the study of classical texts and focused on human potential and achievement. As armies moved, so did the scholars who often accompanied them as advisors or diplomats. When a foreign court captured an Italian city, they also captured its libraries and universities. The printing press, a new technology at the time, played a massive role here. Soldiers could loot printed books, which were far more portable than manuscripts. This meant that copies of works by Petrarch Machiavelli or translations of Plato could find their way to a library in Paris or a castle in Germany much faster than through peaceful trade alone. The chaos of war paradoxically sped up the dissemination of knowledge. So, while we rightly remember the Renaissance for its breathtaking art and profound intellectual shifts, it's essential to understand the messy, complex, and often violent context in which it happened. The wars of the era, particularly the Italian wars, acted as an unintentional distribution network. They broke down geographical barriers and forced an unprecedented level of interaction between different cultures. The very soldiers marching to conquer a city became the unlikely messengers of its cultural brilliance, carrying the seeds of the Renaissance across the Alps and planting them throughout Europe, where they would grow into unique national movements. It's a powerful reminder that history is rarely simple, and sometimes, even in the midst of destruction, the human drive to create and share finds a way to flourish. Thank you so much for watching. What are your thoughts on this paradox? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more content. And now let the fire take you into a world of calm and dreams.